Hi, welcome to On Air. I'm Klara Syrewicz. While all eyes are fixed on the Middle East, there's a mounting sense of anxiety among European NATO members regarding the threat posed by Moscow. Today we explore the roots of this urgency and what lies ahead for the alliance. Meanwhile, our report assesses the war's toll in Russia. As NATO countries convened in The Hague this week for the alliance's summit, its ability to project unified geopolitical strength was not entirely there. The main challenge wasn't reaching consensus on a 5% defence spending hike. It was averting a meltdown from NATO's most crucial member. The US president's famously short attention span, remember he left the G7 early, meant this summit was trimmed to just 2.5 hours, literally for fear he might get bored. Added to that concern was the possibility that he no longer sees Russia's actions in Ukraine, or anywhere else for that matter, as a security priority. Now, despite trying to spin recent events to his advantage, Trump may have been in fact cornered by Netanyahu and drawn into military involvement with Iran, a move many of his voters oppose. It's easy to imagine he may be put in a similar bind by Putin, but with the exact opposite effect. Putin could grow bolder while Trump does nothing, either to avoid a domestic backlash or because he'd be momentarily mesmerized by something else.
I mean, I've spoken to Putin a lot, and he actually was very nice. He volunteered help on, as you know, on Iran. I said, no, I don't need help on Iran, I need help on Russia.
Indeed, since Israel's strike, Russia has seized the moment, escalating attacks on Ukrainian civilians. It's also profiting from Middle Eastern turmoil, with crude oil prices up nearly 20%. Given that hydrocarbons account for over 60% of Russia's exports and a third of state revenues, that spike helps bankroll the war. Moscow will spend 6.3% of its GDP on defence this year, the highest level since the Cold War. Satellite imagery reveals extensive military build-up near Finland's border, increased activity near Estonia just 100 kilometers from the frontier, and upgrades to Moscow's nuclear base in Kaliningrad. Finland's defense intelligence chief says the country expects the number of Russian troops amassing at its gate to triple within 5 years. In response, several countries bordering Russia decided to leave or consider a departure from the anti-personnel landmine treaty. Latvia's latest military intelligence report also flagged a surge in Russian airspace violations. These moves suggest more than posturing. There's an undercurrent of preparations to widen the conflict in Ukraine and whispers of a probe to NATO's Article 5 to test various members' reluctance to get involved. Just days after Israel's strike, Putin returned to his long-standing fixation of reuniting Russian-speaking nations under Moscow's control. He bluntly declared Ukraine belonged to Russia and that, in fact, Moscow owns any land where a Russian soldier sets foot.
Вся Украина наша. Там, где ступает нога русского солдата, то наша.
That logic puts all former Soviet republics on his radar, especially the Baltic states, which are home to large Russian-speaking minorities. Germany's defense chief recently made it quite plain, saying Putin is planning a west-facing attack.
It's clear that there's an intention, and Putin has stated it several times now, and not only Putin, but the entire administration in there. There's an intent, and there's a build-up of the stocks. And this culminates, I would say, and this is what the analysts are assessing, in 2029.
Across NATO's eastern flank, wartime medical planning is no longer theoretical. Countries are stockpiling trauma kits, equipping medics with body armour and preparing for mass casualties. Another reason why everyone might be getting jittery is because Putin himself has come under increased internal pressure after Ukraine's daring Operation Spiderweb, which damaged or destroyed at least 20 Russian bombers, humiliating Moscow and emboldening hardliner elites. They are urging Putin to formally declare war. Although the West calls it a war, Putin still labels it a special military operation, a distinction that matters because it doesn't imply a full-scale escalation. For now, most Russian troops are volunteers lured by paychecks. Declaring war would allow the Kremlin to call up 2 million reservists and deploy intercontinental missiles. Fabricating a provocation or starting a conflict on NATO territory, possibly involving third countries like Belarus, may give the regime a similar tactic to that used by Netanyahu, who deflected everyone's gaze away from Gaza and turned it on Iran. For Russia, this would be a convenient pretext for mass mobilization, even without invoking Ukraine. In a recent brilliant podcast called The War Game, Sky News invited real UK politicians to role-play a Russian attack on Britain. The scenario begins with a massive explosion at a Russian naval base. Moscow knows terrorists were behind it, but blames London. Days later, 2 British F-35 pilots are killed, cyber attacks surge, and Russia launches a snap naval exercise. And it turns out the British are utterly unequipped to respond. If you think this is far-fetched, consider what Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, one of Putin's longest-serving confidants, said about the spiderweb attack.
Украинской стороной, но она была бы беспомощна без поддержки англичан.
Even NATO's Secretary-General Mark Rutte didn't hold back from a bit of threat inflation.
Look, if you do not do this, if we would not go to the 5%, including the 3.5% core defense spending, you could still have the National Health Service, or in other countries their health systems, the pension systems, etc. But you'd better learn to speak Russian.
You might argue that the urgency has certainly been hyped ahead of the NATO gathering with the explicit purpose to cement the spending target. But that number didn't come out of nowhere and, interestingly, not out of Donald Trump's mouth. Since 2022, the Allies have been drafting collective defence plans approved last year, and everyone knew how much they would cost. Now comes the hard part. We have to pay for them. The 5% is ambitious, but Rutte proposed splitting it. 3.5 for core defence, like troops or weapons, and 1.5 for related areas like cybersecurity and infrastructure. And that latter chunk may prove vital. NATO's military mobility is a growing source of concern. What use are tanks and anti-aircraft systems if they can't move across Europe, air refuelling isn't possible, or the power grid goes offline? Which is why everyone needed a hard reminder that the current 2% of GDP wouldn't fly. Fortunately, the EU's Rearm Europe initiative and the Readiness 2030 plan provide a backing, with 800 billion euros earmarked for defence. But regardless of this, Spain and Slovakia were granted exemptions, with Robert Fico grumbling about leaving the alliance altogether. As for Trump, he exempted himself. The US will stick to its current 3.4%. Trump, perhaps second only to Lavrov, remains one of NATO's most vocal critics. His questioning of the alliance's relevance found an echo in Italy's defence minister, who recently claimed NATO, as it is, has no reason to exist. Further gnawing at the alliance's unity are the usual suspects on the European far right and far left, often sympathetic to Moscow, like Germany's Sarah Wagenknecht and Italy's five-star leader Giuseppe Conte, who warned that military spending will gut pensions and hospitals to prepare for hypothetical faraway threats. Countries closer to Russia have, unsurprisingly, been more eager to raise defence budgets. But for much of Western Europe, the threat still feels distant. In a worst-case scenario, the assumption is that trouble will stay in the East, and only then will the real worrying begin. Except by then, Europe's tightly wound economy will be in freefall. So is this really tanks versus healthcare and butter? Everyone acknowledges the peace dividend is over, and with the US stepping back, Europe has little choice. As Mark Rutte notes, countries easily spend a quarter of their GDP on social services. 2 to 5% isn't asking much for stronger defence. Of course, some argue that Russia has struggled to conquer Ukraine, a much smaller neighbour, so how could it possibly take on NATO? But the real question is what Putin wants and how he defines Russia's sphere of influence. As far as he's concerned, Ukraine belongs to Russia, as do former Soviet republics in the Baltics and Black Sea neighbours like Moldova and Georgia, plus parts of the Balkans. The sphere of influence extends to all former Warsaw Pact countries, with Hungary, Slovakia and Serbia having one foot in it already. Eastern flank countries are realistic about that. If something happens, they are unlikely to be caught unaware. But as Edward Lucas points out,
that cannot be said for almost all countries farther west, who are still stuck in the 1990s when it comes to defense, deterrence, and resilience.
There's numerous definitions of Article 5, you know that, right?
Critics often note that Article 5 only commits NATO members to consult, but doesn't constrain to act. Yet that ambiguity is how NATO deterrence works. No one knows what would result from an attack on a member state of this nuclear alliance. And in that sense, NATO's great vulnerability isn't a particular adversary, it's a loss of credibility. With Trump's constant musings about Article 5 and his dizzying array of foreign policy priorities, from the Gaza Riviera to Greenland and annexing Canada, NATO credibility has already taken a hit. And since his promise to fix Ukraine fast has fizzled, there's the spectre of, well, boredom and a petulant approach where both sides are blamed and led to fight it out. That could eventually translate into full isolationism, even in the face of Russian incursions on NATO territory, to the delight of J.D. Vance. As Bloomberg writes,
with the Russian smokescreen sowing confusion, Trump might hesitate to act. Rather than the unambiguous response sought by allies, it is not unimaginable that Trump instead posts on Truth Social calling for peace, not war, or urging Europe to talk with Vladimir.
Indeed, the most unsettling constant in Trump's erratic foreign policy over 2 terms now is his unfailing desire to be Putin's friend, because allies will not decide for him whom to respect and what to do. Except maybe Netanyahu, but that's another story. While European officials track Putin's military ramp-up, others calculate the costs already incurred during 3 years of war in Ukraine. Although grim records are set, the Russian government signals its readiness to grind on for the next decades. Let's look at its economic, military and human toll so far.
The war in Ukraine has profoundly reshaped Russia's economy, society and state priorities. Beneath headline GDP growth and low unemployment figures lies a fragile system, increasingly distorted by the demands of a full-scale wartime economy. Massive fiscal stimulus, more than 10% of GDP between 2022 and 2024, has powered short-term growth, with defense production and military salaries now central pillars of economic activity. Yet this engine runs hot and unsustainably. Sectors unrelated to the war effort are stagnating or shrinking, while inflation is rising, the ruble is weakening, and long-term fiscal pressures are mounting.
I limit myself in many things now. I don't buy beef, it's too expensive for me. I still buy milk, bread and chicken for soup. I rarely buy cottage cheese because everything is very expensive. I buy just enough so that I don't starve to death. I'm telling you honestly.
Military expenditure has reached Cold War-era levels, accounting for over 40% of federal spending in 2024. Recruiting and sustaining a force of hundreds of thousands has led to enlistment bonuses and salaries that dwarf civilian wages, fueling wage growth and consumer spending, but also placing unsustainable pressure on both federal and regional budgets. As more than 3 million people are now tied economically to military service, any future cuts to these payouts will risk political backlash.
In armed conflicts in the past, the state would fail to appreciate people who put their lives on the line. And when people aren't appreciated, they start to hold a grudge against the system.
Casualty figures paint an even starker picture. According to Western intelligence and independent Russian sources, over 1 million Russian troops have been killed or wounded since February of 2022.
According to the accepted standards, we should have 10 prosthetists per 1 million people, and we have fewer than 1,000 of them in the country. That's a big deficit considering the fact that we're in a time of war and that we're giving them sports prosthetics, which require regular replacement. We have a huge shortage of personnel, especially in smaller towns.
These losses vastly exceed those of the Soviet-Afghan War or the Chechen campaigns, marking this as Russia's deadliest conflict since World War II. Financial compensation for casualties now absorbs billions in public funds.
Everything there is actually more serious, more scary, more horrible. You don't see everything on TV.
At home, public opinion has been shaped by high wages and benefits linked to the war, while the Kremlin's propaganda machine works relentlessly to frame the conflict as a noble mission, blurring the line between hardship and prosperity.
The duty of every man, every citizen, is to step up and defend their motherland, their home, their families, their mothers, wives, and children, just like our people have always done, like our grandfathers and great-grandfathers did back in 1941.
Just this year, local officials gifted mothers of fallen soldiers meat grinders, an appliance that, in both Russian and English, carries the same grim double meaning, often used to describe the Kremlin's disregard for soldiers' lives on the front line. The longer this continues, the more deeply entrenched the perception may become that wartime sacrifice brings economic reward. But with labor shortages, exhausted industrial capacity, and rising external pressure, the sustainability of this model is rapidly approaching its limits.
Regardless of these losses, the threat is mounting. And to think it would have been implausible just a few years ago. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week.